Chapter 7. "Vagabond!" the woman cried in a shrill voice. "House thief!" She advanced down the steps, still pointing her finger at Mr. Glass. Her hand shook, and next to him she looked tiny and fragile, yet she faced up to him as if she were a warrior. I admired her immensely. I remained on the pavement, waiting to see Mr. Glass's response. Cyclops didn't move the coach onward, and Duke now joined Willie at the door. Unlike her, his gaze was on Mr. Glass, not the woman. He looked concerned. A quick glance at Mr. Glass proved why. The telltale signs of exhaustion tugged at his eyes and mouth. "You're mistaken, madam," he said. "I own this house." He owned it? I'd thought he'd simply leased it. How did an American come to own a house in one of London's best areas? "You cannot own this house," the woman said with a haughty sniff. "My nephew does." Willie's eyes widened so far they were in danger of popping out of her head. "Coyote balls," Duke muttered. Mr. Glass blinked several times before finally clearing his throat. "Then you must be Miss Letitia Glass." He bowed. "I'm Matthew Glass, your nephew." The woman stumbled backward, only to trip up the stair. Willie and Duke caught her and righted her. She hardly seemed aware of her near accident or the people behind her, despite another colourful phrase spilling from Duke's lips. "No," she muttered. No. You cannot be Matthew. He's in America, doing American things. He would write to notify me of his arrival." She leaned forward, squinted hard at him, then leaned back and continued her scrutiny, as if the distance would help her see better. "Why would I write when I've never written before?" Mr. Glass said. "Aunt Letitia—" "Don't call me that!" she snapped. She reached out and caught his chin. He could have avoided her grip, but he bore her inspection as she turned his head from side to side. You do have some of the Glass bearing, and you're as handsome as your father. But you cannot be Matthew. He's only 30. You look much older." "He's been ill," Willie said. Mr. Glass gave his cousin a sharp glare as Letitia Glass let him go. "I'm unconvinced. Prove to me that you are Matthew, and I'll allow you to stay here." "You'll allow me?" "Yes, I'll allow you, Mr. Whoever you are. The more I see of you, the more I doubt you are my nephew. My dearest brother would not bring up his son to be impertinent to his aunt. Harry had manners." At mention of his father, Mr. Glass lowered his head. He heaved a sigh. "You prove who you are," Duke said before Mr. Glass could respond. The tiny woman turned to him. "Everyone knows me." She waved a hand at the neighbouring window. The curtain moved, and the face that had been watching disappeared. "I am well known in London. I am a dear friend to the Queen." She touched the grey curls at the nape of her neck, poking out from beneath the cloud of black veil surrounding her hat. "I've been painted by masters, courted by foreign princes, and dined in palaces. A white knight even slayed a dragon for me once." Stunned silence followed her odd pronouncement as we all stared at her. A light rain began to fall, and the curtain of the neighbour's house parted again. Letitia Glass stood in the centre of us with an outwardly thrust chin, a straight back, and a glint in her eye that I now suspected was madness. "Miss Glass," I said gently, "my name is India Steele, and I'm pleased to make your acquaintance. Please come inside out of the rain. We'll have a cup of tea and see if we can sort out this misunderstanding. I give my word that no one will harm you." She took in my face, my clothes, the reticule dangling from my wrist. "You do seem like a good, respectable English girl." She shot Willie a barbed glance. Willie opened her mouth to say something, but Mr. Glass shook his head, and she shut it again. Miss Letitia Glass stepped back onto the porch, and after a brief hesitation, took Duke's offered arm. "No one will harm her," Mr. Glass murmured in my ear, his hand on my elbow gripped hard. "You think me capable of hurting elderly ladies?" "Mr. Glass." I stopped myself from telling him I didn't trust him, and instead said, "It reassured her, did it not? Is there anything you can show her to prove who you are?" "Is that for her benefit or yours?" He let me go and indicated I should step inside ahead of him. "I never doubted you were Matthew Glass," I said, passing him. "Until now." Mr. Glass didn't join us, and Duke disappeared after depositing Miss Glass on the drawing-room sofa. I sat beside her, hoping my presence would give her some sense of comfort, although she didn't look in need of it. She sat as if she ought to be just there, her black skirts taking up much of the sofa. She touched a polished black stone set in gold, clasped to her dress at the base of her throat, and wrinkled her nose. "This room is stale," she announced. "You ought to open it up." "There ain't no point," Willie said. "We'll be gone soon, and it's always raining here anyways, or the air's sooty." "Miss Glass," I said, "tell me about your nephew, Matthew." I wanted to learn as much about him as possible before he returned. That's if the fellow who'd employed me was in fact her nephew. "Ask him yourself," Willie cut in. Would he answer me? She merely shrugged. "My brother is so dear to me," Miss Glass said wistfully. Her eyes turned cloudy, and I doubted whether she saw her surroundings at all. "He's so lively and jolly and terribly kind. He excels at everything he puts his hand to, so clever and amiable. Everyone adores him and wants to be his friend. Except Papa, of course." Her mouth twisted into a frown. "And Richard." Miss Glass?" I glanced at Willie. She shrugged back. "I was asking after Matthew Glass, your nephew, not your brother." "Your brother is dead." Willie raised her voice as if Miss Glass were deaf. "Willie!" I hissed. Miss Glass stirred and shifted on the sofa. "Yes, of course he is. I know that." She lowered her head, but not before I saw tears spring to her eyes. "What do you know about Matthew?" I tried again. "Nothing," Miss Glass said. "I've never met him. Harry wrote to me when his wife bore a son. That was 30 years ago, but it feels like yesterday. I was happy for him, for them both, although I never met her, of course. Her people were poor American folk, you see, and not at all suitable for a Glass. But Harry, being Harry, married her anyway. He always was the romantic one." She sighed. Willie bristled. "Poor American folk?" she echoed. "Quite the wrong sort," Miss Glass told her. "All very rough, so one of Harry's early letters said." She sighed again. "He wrote often after he announced Matthew's birth, but Richard hid the letters from me. The housekeeper told me about them, but she didn't dare take them like I asked." "Who is Richard?" I ventured. "My brother and the current Baron of Rycroft." "Baron?" both Willie and I blurted out. "A proper baron, or is that just what folk like to call him?" Willie asked. "Why would anyone call him a baron if he's not one?" Miss Glass laughed like a young girl. "Silly Americans," she said to me, as if sharing a private joke with another Englishwoman. I was still too stunned to respond, however. Mr. Glass was the nephew of a baron. but he was far too foreign, and although he could act the gentleman well enough, there was nothing noble about him. Surely there was a mistake, and he wasn't the Matthew Glass related to this woman. That would make him a liar and a squatter, as she'd called him. It wasn't much of a stretch from there to outlaw. Dread settled into my bones. If this woman could prove he wasn't Matthew Glass, then she could be in danger from him. Duke entered carrying a tray. I poured the tea because Willie was busy telling Duke what Miss Glass had said. I used both hands, the one steadying the other. "Did you know?" Willie pestered Duke. He shook his head. "You didn't? You're his cousin." "Cousin?" Miss Glass humphed. "What did I tell you, Miss Steele? My brother married into a rough American family, and there's the proof." She accepted the cup and bestowed a genteel smile upon me, as if she hadn't just insulted Willie. Willie advanced on her, hands on her hips, her nostrils flaring like a raging bull's. She didn't speak for an entire 20 seconds, simply breathed heavily and glared daggers at Miss Glass. "You'd take that back," she finally said. "Why should she?" Duke grunted. "She's right." Willie marched back to him and punched him so hard in the shoulder that he was forced back a step. She stormed out of the drawing room to the sound of his chuckles. "We beat you in the war," she shouted back. "We've been at war with America?" Miss Glass asked, a hand to her chest. "Dear me, how dreadful." "I think she's referring to the War of Independence over 100 years ago," I said, trying not to smile in relief. Willie, at least, wasn't a threat, at present. Miss Glass sipped her tea. "Where is he?" she asked, looking past Duke to the door. "Where is the fellow claiming to be my nephew? I want another look at him." "Keep your hair on," Duke said. "He'll be back soon." Miss Glass patted her grey curls. Mr. Glass strode into the drawing room, and Miss Glass immediately sat up straighter. She couldn't take her eyes off him, nor he her. He looked healthier again, the signs of illness and exhaustion gone. He dragged a chair over to sit near her and handed her a tintype photograph. He held another back. "This is me with my parents," he said quietly. "I was about 3 years of age." He watched Miss Glass's reaction intently. Her eyes shone with unshed tears as she traced the man in the photograph with her thumb. It must be her brother, then. He looked remarkably like Mr. Glass did now, only with a moustache and hair parted at the side. He stood a little behind the seated woman with hooped skirts. She was very pretty, with slender features and large eyes. She held the hand of the little boy scowling at the camera. He looked like he resented having to stand still for so long. "And this is me with my parents just before they fell ill. I was 15. The couple's appearance had hardly changed. Her gown was dark instead of light, the skirts not quite so broad, and she wore a bonnet over her hair. The man's hairline had begun to recede a little, but he was still very handsome. The boy had grown up and now stood behind his mother's other side. He was taller than his father, with wide shoulders, and he no longer scowled at the camera, but looked directly into it with calm countenance. His face may have been more youthful, but it was unmistakably the man sitting opposite. And he was most assuredly the son of the man in both photographs. It was a wonder Miss Glass hadn't noticed the striking familiarity immediately upon seeing him. Then again, she was touched in the head. She sniffed loudly. Mr. Glass handed her his handkerchief and she dabbed at her eyes. "Harry," she whispered, stroking the tintype again. "My dearest Harry." Mr. Glass watched her, his elbows on his knees, his throat moving with his swallow. Aunt Letitia, he murmured. She wiped her cheek with the handkerchief and handed back the photographs. She clasped both his hands. Matthew, she whispered, we have so much to discuss. We must be quick. Quick, why? She flapped the hand that held the handkerchief. Is it true your parents died from an illness? He nodded. Both died within weeks of the other. Then what did you do? He leaned back in the chair and studied each of the tintypes. Returned to my mother's family in California until I was old enough to leave, he added with chilling bite. I sat on the edge of my seat, waiting for him to dole out more pieces of the puzzle that could help me to solve the mystery of Mr. Glass. Why did you come to England after all this time? She asked. Harry vowed never to return. I'm looking for someone. His gaze flicked to me, then back to his aunt. It was the first time he'd acknowledged my presence since walking into the drawing room. I see. Well, I'm glad you came. She wrung his hand in both of hers. Are you married? He pulled free. No. Promised to anyone? No. Excellent. We must find you a bride now that you're home, a good English girl, someone from our set. She clicked her tongue. If only I knew who the right girls are nowadays. Aunt, please, I'm not looking for a bride, just a watchmaker. Again, he glanced at me. He must want to get away to speak with the watchmaker known as Mirth. Nor am I here for long. I leave on Tuesday. Tuesday? But that's too soon. He stood. She tried to clasp his hand, but he moved away. He couldn't have failed to notice the attempt, however. He held himself rigidly as he went to stand by the mantel, as far away from us as possible while remaining in the room. I hope you're well, Aunt. Fit as a fiddle, but Matthew and my Uncle Richard. She clicked her tongue. Still alive? More's the pity. Does he take care of your needs? Mr. Glass asked. I'm adequately fed and housed, like one of his horses, if that's what you mean. She clasped her hands on her lap, her proud chin once more tilted at an imperial angle. This was a woman aware of her elevated position in the world. The madness was nowhere to be seen. Does he know I'm in England? Mr. Glass asked. Yes. Did he have me followed? Followed? Why would he follow you? I don't know the answer to that, but I do know that I'm being followed. So that was why he constantly looked out the coach window this morning. When? Duke sounded worried. Mr. Glass dismissed his question with a shake of his head. Duke's lips flattened, and I thought he'd argue, but Miss Glass started talking again. Richard heard that Harry's house was occupied, she said, indicating the room we sat in. So the house had belonged to Mr. Glass's father, not the Rycroft estate. That explained why Mr. Matthew Glass had inherited it. I don't know who alerted him, perhaps one of the neighbours. Most likely. I've seen them watching me, but none have greeted us. I overheard Richard telling Beatrice that someone was occupying the house. He didn't inform me directly. Beatrice? His wife. Mr. Glass nodded slowly. Was my name mentioned? No, just that the house was occupied and he would look into it. He hasn't been here, Mr. Glass said. Nobody from the family has, until you. It was only this morning that I overheard Richard and Beatrice discussing it. I came as soon as I could get away. I couldn't bear the thought of squatters in my Harry's house. Good of you to be concerned. I couldn't be sure from his tone if he was being sincere or not. I was very concerned. I doubted Richard would lift a finger to check. As soon as I escaped, I came here. We all leaned forward, brows raised. Escaped, Mr. Glass said. From Uncle Richard? No, from Beatrice. I asked her to take me shopping. I'm not allowed out on my own, you see. Why not? I buy things. Then Richard gets angry that I've spent too much money, even though it's my money to spend. I have an allowance. Oh, and I talk to people." She grinned as if it were the naughtiest thing to do, and she only did it to annoy her brother. "You're not allowed to talk to people?" I asked, when Mr. Glass said nothing. He looked contemplative. "Richard only allows me to receive callers in his presence or Beatrice's. He doesn't want me telling them what a cruel man he is to me. Appearances are important to him, more important than me." "Aunt Letitia, he can't possibly be as bad as that," Mr. Glass said. "Are you calling me a liar?" He sucked in a sharp breath. "Not at all. I know my father didn't get along with his father, and Richard usually took their father's side, but—" "Usually?" She sniffed. "It was every time. Richard knew what side his bread was buttered on. No spine, that's always been his problem. Harry, however, had more bottle than anyone I've ever met. That was his problem, you see." The anger and vigour drained out of her as she spoke, and the wistful gaze returned to her eyes. I half expected her to mention white knights and dragons again. "Harry was selfless and brave, with a kind heart. He told our father when he was being unfair to our farmers and staff, and father hated him for it. He hated him for being generous, hated him for being better at everything, and hated him for speaking out. He and Richard despised Harry for being himself." I watched Mr. Glass from beneath my lashes. He went utterly still and didn't speak a word. After a moment, he swallowed heavily and blinked rapidly. I wasn't quite sure if it was a show of emotion or not. "Does he beat you?" Duke asked Miss Glass. We all looked at him. "Does your brother beat you, ma'am?" He stated it matter-of-factly, as if one asked strangers that sort of thing all the time. Distaste rippled across Miss Glass's features. "Who are you to ask me such a question?" "I'm Matt's friend." "I thought you were the butler." Duke narrowed his eyes at Mr. Glass. "I need a drink. Want one?" Mr. Glass waved him off, and Duke left the drawing room. A rather awkward silence followed his departure. I waited for aunt and nephew to fall into a discussion about family members and catch up on old times, but they did not. It would seem they needed some assistance to get to know one another. "Why did your brother Harry leave England, Miss Glass?" I asked. Her eyes misted again, and I regretted bringing it up, but I was wildly curious. I knew I shouldn't be. The family was none of my affair. Yet I waited impatiently for her answer. Unfortunately, she suddenly stiffened. Her gaze sharpened and cleared. "Who are you, Miss Steele? Why are you here?" "I'm also a friend of your nephew's," I said. He did not counter me, but amusement touched the corners of his mouth. He watched me openly, challenging me to pile more lies onto the heap. No doubt he would remind me of them later, then watch me try to dig my way out. "More acquaintances, really?" I didn't want to tell her I worked for him. It would immediately lessen my status in her eyes, and she might cease talking in front of me, the hired help. "Acquaintance?" She nodded slowly, eyeing me again, and this time I felt certain she was assessing every piece of my clothing, right down to the cotton thread. "So I see. A mistress would be better attired and wear jewellery. No Glass would be so stingy as to dress his woman in grey cotton. So what is the nature of your acquaintance with my nephew?" "She's my assistant," Mr. Glass answered before I could think of something. "She assists me in my work." "You work?" She looked as if she'd tasted something sour. "Of course I work," he said. "Doesn't everyone?" I rolled my eyes. The man had no idea. The American upper classes might work and be proud of it, but here The best families didn't like dirtying their hands. Most lived off their land holdings or made good marriages. Of course, there were wealthy gentlemen merchants, manufacturers, bankers and the like, but few in the nobility had done a hard day of labour in their life. "Tell her what work you do, Mr. Glass." It was rather fun watching him squirm as he tried to think of something, and I found it difficult to keep my smile off my face. Clearly, he deemed it necessary to lie to her. That thought wiped my smile clean away. If he had to lie, then his work involved something secretive, like being an outlaw, perhaps? "I manage the family affairs," he said, giving me a smug, flat-lipped smile. "What business is your family in?" I inquired. "Stop this talk at once." Miss Glass shuddered. "Your family is here, Matthew, and we do not discuss such vulgar things." "With respect, Aunt, I have family on 2 continents. My American family may not be as—" He drummed his fingers on the side of his teacup as he thought. "They may not be as highly regarded as the Glasses, but they're still family." She picked up her cup too. "I admire your loyalty, but do try to remember that your father's family are nobility and your mother's are riffraff." I thought he would be offended, but he merely muttered, "I'm not that loyal," into his teacup. "Indeed," she said, her tone dry. "Why did you never write to me? Your father did." "You just told me his letters were kept from you, so what does it matter if I wrote or not?" "It matters." I nodded in agreement. He scowled at me, then turned back to his aunt. "With respect, I don't know you. Writing to someone I've never met felt odd." "That doesn't excuse it." He looked uncomfortable, and I felt a little sympathy for him, although I couldn't think why he deserved it. "Now that you've met, I'm sure writing to one another will be easier," I said. "I promise to write when I'm back home," Mr. Glass assured his aunt. She looked pained. "We've only just met and already you're talking about leaving me." "This was only ever going to be a fleeting visit." "Yes, but now that you're here, why not stay longer? I can introduce you to all my friends and acquaintances. The Queen! Oh, you must meet the Queen and the Prince Consort too. Such a happy couple." Oh dear. The Prince Consort had died years ago. Miss Glass's madness was a fickle affliction, sometimes making her seem perfectly normal, until she uttered something outrageous. Mr. Glass knew it too. His shoulders rounded as if the weight of her madness was a personal burden he had to carry. And yet he also seemed to want to have little to do with her. He hadn't written, for one thing, and hadn't asked her to stay for lunch. It was terribly impolite of him, and I decided to rectify it immediately. "Miss Glass, would you join us for lunch today? Cyclops can return you to your brother's house afterward." "No." She set the teacup down with a clatter. Then, as if her own vehemence surprised her, she pressed a hand to her stomach and said, "I'd rather not return to Richard's home." Mr. Glass and I exchanged glances. "At all?" he asked her. "At all. I thought perhaps that now you're here—" "No." Her eyes filled with tears, and she dipped her head to hide them. I scowled at Mr. Glass, but he merely turned his head away. Heartless man. I touched Miss Glass's hand. "Your nephew would happily welcome you into his household, but I'm afraid he's leaving in less than a week," I reminded her. She humphed. "We shall see." I did like her conviction, but it saddened me that she wanted to stay with Mr. Glass so much. Her situation with her brother mustn't be a happy one if she was so eager to live with a nephew she hardly knew and his rough friends and family. I squeezed her hand, and she surprised me by squeezing it back. A commotion outside drew everyone's attention. Mr. Glass was at the door in 4 long strides, but he fell back as a woman breezed into the drawing room. She was tall and slender, with skin so pale the veins in her throat stood out. I guessed her to be younger than Miss Glass, but it was difficult to determine her exact age. The skin around her eyes and forehead was pulled back by the tight arrangement of her hair beneath her turban. The smoothness contrasted the deep grooves drooping from each corner of her mouth to her chin. Her hazel eyes flashed in Miss Glass's direction. She didn't seem to notice anyone else as she strode up to the elderly woman on the sofa. Miss Glass shrank back and leaned toward me. "What is the meaning of this?" Mr. Glass growled. "Who are you?" The woman didn't turn around. She held out her hand to Miss Glass. "I knew you'd be here. Come, Letitia, leave this place at once." "I'd rather stay." Miss Glass picked up her teacup, only to have her arm wrenched by the newcomer. Tea spilled, and I caught the cup before it tumbled to the floor. "Beatrice!" Miss Glass gasped. So this was her sister-in-law, Lady Rycroft. She certainly wasn't behaving in a very ladylike manner. Lady Rycroft's grip must have been hard because she marched Miss Glass toward the door. "Richard will be furious when I tell him you ran away from me," she spat. "I knew the shopping expedition was a ruse. I told him so, but he wouldn't listen to me." Mr. Glass stepped in the way, blocking the exit. He could look quite formidable when he wanted to, and I felt relieved to see him finally take some interest in his aunt's welfare. "Unhand her," he snarled. "I beg your pardon?" Lady Rycroft may have been tall for a woman, but she only came up to his chin, even when she straightened her spine. "I am Lady Rycroft and your aunt. You will treat me with the respect I deserve." So she knew who he was then. I tried to think of something diplomatic to ease the tensions, but I could think of nothing. Behind Mr. Glass, Duke and Willie gathered close to hear the exchange. "You can be sure that I will," he said, "when you've shown me you deserve my respect. You come into my house without greeting and drag out one of my guests against her will. I think I'm entitled to tell you to unhand her." "I will not. You don't know how she is. She needs her rest at home. Her head is soft, you see." "My head is perfectly all right, thank you." Miss Glass sniffed in her sister-in-law's direction. "Unhand her, and she will return home of her own free will," Mr. Glass said. "After lunch." "No!" Miss Glass cried. I almost shouted at him too. How could he be so cruel? She clearly didn't want to return to her brother's house. "Can't she stay here for a few days while you're in London?" I dared venture. "Then she could return. Or I could find other arrangements for her in the meantime." I expected him to admonish me for my impertinence, but he merely looked away, although not before I saw a shadow pass over his eyes. "He won't leave England." Honestly, Miss Glass's determination that he would remain wasn't helping the situation. "I've made my decision," he said. "You may stay for luncheon, Aunt Letitia, but no longer. I'm a busy man and I don't have time for callers." He spun on his heel and stalked out the door. "Duke, see Lady Rycroft out." "You must return her yourself," Lady Rycroft said to his back. "She cannot be trusted with one of your men. She's very cunning." "Very well," he said in low tones that only just reached us. "It's about time I met my uncle anyway." "He looks forward to meeting you." "I doubt it." Lady Rycroft let her sister-in-law go and, head high, eased past the others, careful not to brush up against any of them. I expected Miss Glass to break down in hysteria or run after her nephew to plead with him, but she merely gathered her skirts and smiled at me. "Will you be joining us for luncheon, Miss Steele?" she asked, as if nothing were amiss. "I would very much like your company."